Well, everyone, this is the second video in the series of videos that we're going to be looking at on lesson planning. This one dealing with objectives. Hopefully you watched the first video on foundations and introductions leading up to this. In this one, we're going to continue the work that we started, looking at the work that we need to start doing some writing objectives for our lesson plans. So if you haven't watched that first video, stop, go back, watch it, because a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about in this video will sort of reference that one. So with that said, let's get started. So the first thing that I want to do is look at the overview of what I would like to accomplish with this video. And if you are fairly observant, you'll notice that this carries over from the for next time part of the previous video. And one of the things I think is really important in doing a lesson plan is that you have this degree of continuity, that a lesson should, where possible, sort of pick up where the previous lesson was. So you have this sort of continuous narrative that kind of runs through your lessons rather than them being just sort of like discrete elements. When students start to understand and expect that the way we end on Monday is the way we begin on Tuesday, at least to some extent, then that encourages students to finish strong on Monday, knowing that it's going to be carried over, rather than Monday just sort of ends and everyone just sort of like mills around the door, or, sitting there staring at the clock. That, we use this continuity to keep students motivated and learning during class. So this is identical to how we ended the previous video, and that's not coincidence, that's by design. So we're going to start looking at the structure of a lesson plan. We're going to define this framework, which is going to carry over from the frameworks that we looked at in the previous video. And then we're going to actually write some objectives using that framework. So look at how to use these pieces to actually start doing the work. So this is what we hope to be doing in this video. So we're going to start with what I think of as like the pre-planning stage. And I think one of the things that's really important in writing a lesson plan is to think about what you want the lesson to look like, what we call sometimes a lesson image. So, you don't have to like literally close your eyes, but if you were to close your eyes and think about what is it that I want to get done that day, and how do I see the activities being placed? How do I see sort of the pacing of the lesson? Do I start with A and then go to B and then go to C, or should I switch C and B? Should I do C first? What builds on what? How much time do I need to spend on things? Like, how do I start to see all the pieces in sort of a Tetris kind of way fitting together in my mind so everything sort of makes sense? When I student taught, my placement was about 30-40 minutes away from where I was living, and I mean, I hated that drive, and yet I started to find that like that time was really important for me to start thinking about my lesson image. I didn't have a whole lot else to do, sitting there driving. So I would think a lot about the lesson. And so even though I would have the lesson already prepared the day before, the week before, when I started to really think about, okay, how is this going to work? How is this going to play out? What do I have to do differently with third hour that I feel like I'm going to be doing with first hour? Because of sort of where they are with the material, or what their personalities are, or the way the classroom is being managed. All these little differences start to develop, a universal lesson image, but then also sort of like little specific changes and tweaks from hour to hour, or potentially even student to student. This is going to be too much of a challenge for one student, so how do I maybe accommodate this in a way that this becomes more meaningful for them, or this is going to be way too basic for that table in the back, that group of students. So how do I add something to this, a little bit of complexity or a little bit of difficulty, so it's more engaging for them? All these little things that, I would be thinking about. So I really came to enjoy that time in the car because it made my teaching better. It made my lessons better. It just sort of made everything better. So I would have liked a shorter commute for sure, but it did give me time to sort of flesh out this idea of a lesson image. Once you have that lesson image, we talked in the previous video about 3 aspects to be thinking about. Who are your students? What is the content? And what is your best approach? So I mentioned that already. Thinking about students um, for whom they may need certainly formalized accommodations we have to do, but sort of these informalized, I think this student needs a little bit of a push. I think this student is going to struggle with this a little bit. Thinking about ways to sort of accommodate, just individualized student learning differences. Thinking about the content, just making sure that I understand the content that I'm teaching. Try not to make mistakes with your content any more than you have to. They will happen, but just thinking about making sure that you really understand the content really, really well. And if you get asked a question, that you're in the best position to answer. Certainly, the more rudimentary questions. You get asked a really complex question, they want to play stump the band. There's not a whole lot you can do. There's times where you just got to admit, I don't know. I'll come back tomorrow with an answer, or I don't know. I'll look into it while you work on this activity. Um, but just being prepared with the content as best you can, and then thinking pragmatically about what is your best approach, what's going to be the best way to teach this. So mentioned that in the previous video. Again, let's be thinking about this going forward, those three pieces, not just focusing on one or two of the three, not just throwing a bunch of content out there, not just engaging with students and not doing any content, a good balance of all three of these. So I want to talk about sequences a little bit, because if you've never really thought about lesson planning that much, then this may be kind of an eye-opening idea for you. A lot of times when we're in class as students, we see lessons taught in a pretty standard sequence. The teacher comes in and says, "This is what we're going to do today," and whether it's that formal or explicit or not, there's some expectation of, okay, this is the work that we're gonna do. So objectives are stated. Then there is some sort of instructional sequence. They do some teaching, we do some learning, we write some stuff down, and we engage in the practice of teaching and learning. And then there's some assessment. And we'll talk a lot more about assessment in the next video. But whether it's a question or a quiz or a test or whatever, there's some sort of assessment. And this might loop back a little bit. So there might be objectives, then instructional sequence, then assessment, and then maybe some more instruction, and then another assessment, and then maybe some more instruction, or maybe even objectives, instruction, assessment, and then go back and say, okay, also today we're going to ... So we may loop all the way back to objectives, but this basic sequence gets repeated in some sort of form of being told, well, this is what we're going to do, doing it, and then measuring whether or not we did it. And this is called the rational linear model, is the name of it. This is the way that a lot of lessons normally get taught. And this should be a familiar, probably pretty comfortable pattern of how a classroom runs for most of us. This is the way that we've seen classes run for most of our lives. Now, that said, sometimes we see lessons that are taught in this second way, where it begins with an instructional sequence and then some sort of assessment and then some sort of objective. And so a lot of times you'll see this in a class where maybe you have a classroom discussion. And so you'll come in right away and think about, in, say, like a language arts class or a social studies class, where you're given a primary document. You may be given a historical document, or you may be given a short story. And you're asked to engage with that right away without really having any clue, like, well, what am I supposed to be doing? And so you read it, you think about it, you may talk about it with a small group or talk about it with a large class. And so you're engaging with the material right away. And then at the end, or not at the very end, but toward the end, the teacher might then do some sort of assessment. So now, what do we think about this? Or how did that compare to what we looked at yesterday? Or how do we anticipate this to change if we were to alter this, or if we were to put this person in this place and this, whatever, move some things around to see how flexibly now you can think about that material. How would this story be different if this character from this other story became the main character in this story? So now the teacher's starting to make sure, like, okay, I know that you read it, I know that you, or at least I know that you looked at the words, but how would you really understand what just took place in the story, or in this poem, or in this historical event, or whatever? So the assessment comes next. And then at the very end, like right before the bell, the objectives get put out there. this is what I wanted to try to accomplish with this today. This is what I wanted you to try to see as to what was going on. And it's not meant as any sort of trickery. Stating the objectives at the end sometimes allows students to see the material with relatively fresh eyes. Sometimes when you put the objectives up front, um, students will start to think, well, I'm supposed to be doing this, and then they're not engaging with the material very objectively. I will tell you, this is kind of a difficult way to teach. It can be hard to do it this way because a lot of your instructional sequence is guiding students toward the objectives without them knowing it and without being really obvious about it. You also have to be really open that students are not going to move toward the objectives that you want. They may see something else that you didn't expect them to see, or maybe, to be completely honest, that you didn't see yourself. And so now you have to really be able to pivot in a way to say, okay, well, I had originally intended this lesson to be about X, but we started end up talking about Y, and I think Y may be a more important thing to be talking about right now. So we'll come back to X tomorrow. It can be a really, really fun way to teach, but it can also be a really challenging way to teach, just because you have to have that flexibility. And I'll be totally honest, you have to have a lot of humility in it as well. You got to be really open to students engaging with something and seeing something in ways that you may not have anticipated, or that you may not have seen in the material either. Anyway, so the point is, we teach these things in a couple of different ways here. There's certainly other ways you could do it, but the way that we're going to plan in this course is we're going to do objectives first, then assessments, then instructional sequence. So today we're talking about objectives, or in this video we're going to talk about objectives, and then next we're going to talk about assessments, and then we're going to talk about our instructional sequence. And the reason for that is because I feel like the first thing we need to do is to determine, like, well, what is it that we're trying to do? We need to know the purpose of the day or the purpose of the lesson. And so that is embodied in that objective writing. I got to know what it is that I'm trying to do. I need to know, where am I trying to go? Where do I want my students to go today? The next question is going to be, how do I know that we got there? And that's the assessment piece. So how do I know that students have done what it is that I would like for them to do? I don't want to take it on faith. I don't want to say I'm such a good teacher, I just assume that they always get there. I need to have something at the end that I know that they got there. And then once I sort of know my starting point and my ending point, then I can start to fill in the gaps in between. And that's that instructional sequence. Now I can start to plot the course from where I am to where I want to be. And this is where we get a little bit more creativity in how we think we're going to get there. And that instructional sequence may be informed by the type of objective. It may be informed by the type of assessment. It may be informed by both. So I can't really plan my instructional sequence until I know those two things. I don't want to pick an instructional sequence just because I feel like doing it. I don't want to, we're going to do a small group project because we haven't done one in a while. That's not very good pragmatic teaching. So I want to be plotting these endpoints and then start to draw the line in between them. So I want to talk a moment here about this idea of a planning cycle. So the first thing that you see here on this upper left region is this planning, this planning third, the purple planning third. And so beginning of the school year, chapter 1, I'm going to come in and I'm going to write my first few lesson plans. Hopefully at least like the first week or so, and have an idea of what's going to happen. Say Monday through Friday, week 1. And so I'm going to write those lesson plans out. I go into class on Monday, and I have my plan. And so I move over to the green section, which is the teaching section. So I'm going to deliver that lesson. I'm going to do that lesson with my students. And at the end of it, I'm going to think about, how did that go? Now, between the first iteration of the lesson and the second iteration of the lesson, you may not have an awful lot of time. You may have a 5-minute passing period between classes, to where big wholesale changes may not be entirely possible. If something really doesn't work, then you've got to make that change right away. Like if that didn't work, you might sometimes have something that didn't work the first time, and maybe you want to try it again with the next class because you have strong reason to believe, you have strong evidence that there was something inherent to that class or that group. Maybe a lesson didn't work because first hour the buses were late and most of the students weren't there, and so you weren't able to do what it was you wanted to do. You don't need to make a huge change on that. That's something that's beyond your control. Um, but if there's something pedagogically that you feel like is unsound in what it is that you were doing, then you've got to make a change. Now, at the end of the day, we start to make bigger changes, and now we've moved into this bottom third here, this increase effectiveness. So whether we're doing it on a micro scale between classes or sort of a slightly more macro scale between days, um, then we're going to start to look at, okay, well, this is what I learned from Monday, so maybe I need to make some changes for Tuesday. Or even Monday went really, really well. What were the things that went really well today? What were the pieces that students really responded to, or the pieces that I really felt comfortable with, or the pieces that really fit with that content? So how does that help me make Tuesday better? Changes are not always something went bad and now I got to fix stuff. Sometimes the changes are that went really well and I've learned something about a strength that I or my students have, uh, either pedagogically or with the content. And so we're going to increase that effectiveness. So now once we start to look at those changes, that increase effectiveness piece, we're going to alter that plan. And so now I come into Tuesday with maybe a slightly different plan or maybe a completely different plan. And then I go in and I teach it. And then I start to make changes for Wednesday. And then I change that plan for Wednesday. Then I teach Wednesday. And you can kind of see where this is going. This cycle keeps repeating. Now, that is a day-to-day interpretation of this. But I also want you to sort of recognize this also working on a couple of different levels. This should also work for students. They should be planning their work that they're doing in your class. The teaching part for them is receiving the teaching, not necessarily doing the teaching. Although in a class that integrates a lot of cooperative, small group, large group work, there could be a teaching element there as well because they're working with each other. Um, so there's a teaching element, and then they're increasing their effectiveness. So this sort of applies pedagogically as well for how students are sort of understanding their role in your classroom. We want to structure this in a way that students have the opportunity to go through this as well. I also want you to think about this cycle on a much more macro scale, that this plan, teach, increase effectiveness, like we talked about, being between periods, between days, but can also be between units that you're doing, between chapters that you're doing. It could also be something that you do from grading period to grading period, where you set aside certain times, at the end of the 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever your grading periods are, to take an hour to just sit down and look over the work that you've done and look over the notes that you've written. Look for themes and patterns. Are there lessons that really went well? Are there lessons that typically don't go well? Are there methodologies that I'm really struggling with? Do I want to get better with them? How do I get better with them? Are there things that I do poorly that there are other teachers that I know do really well? Can I talk with them or observe them, or how do I learn from them? And also from year to year, summer is a nice time for teachers where, we were quote unquote not working, but realistically, you should be reflecting on your practice and thinking about the things that you want to be doing better, going to conferences, reading professional development materials, all these things that we can be doing to make our teaching better. So, we're always in this scale or in this cycle on one scale or another. So let's get into the actual idea of objective writing here, and I genuinely think of this a lot like Mad Libs, and if you hopefully familiar with the idea of Mad Libs, where someone says, give me a noun, give me a verb, give me an adjective, and you write them in without any context for anything, and then when you go back and look at it, you read the story, and it's a nice, fun, silly story here. Um, we're not going to put things in without context. We're very much going to put things in with context, but the idea is that we're going to put things in a very specific formula, in a very specific way. Now, this is not the only way of objective writing. This is not the end all be all. but it is a fairly universal structured way. So we're all kind of looking at this the same way. When you get out into a district, they may say, we don't do SWABAT, we do I can, or student will, or whatever. The idea is still the same. So let's define these pieces here. So the first piece is the SWABAT. Most teachers have heard of SWABAT. They may not all use SWABAT, but this is a fairly common acronym. Student or students will be able to. That's all that stands for. And you know, for people who use this in their lesson planning, you write that 5-word phrase so much, it just seems kind of silly to write the whole thing out. Now, granted, if you're writing this on a computer, you can cut and paste the actual, you know, students will be able to, and you know, writing SWABAT might not save you that much work. But if you're doing it longhand, if you're doing it, you know, if you're actually writing on a piece of paper, then, you know, SWABAT kind of, you know, makes a little bit of sense and saves you some time. Now, once we have students will be able to, that to is the first part of the first half of an infinitive verb. So we need a verb. So the next thing is we're going to put in a verb, and we'll talk about where to find those verbs here in a moment. Then after that, we have some sort of learning target that we have to define. So, you know, students will be able to verb something. What is it that I want them to do? And we'll talk about how to figure out that learning target here in a moment as well. Now, after that, and I put these in curly braces instead of square brackets, because these are not always there. We don't always put an assessment or performance standard at the end of an objective. Some people are really big on doing that. Some teachers are really, that's something that they want to put there, but not everybody does. So to think of an example, just to kind of flesh this out, students will be able to recall. So there's my verb. I want them to remember the state capitals, right? So say geography class, you know, is pretty, you know, or social studies class, maybe a lower level standard, but just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. So students will be able to recall state capitals at 90% efficiency, or at 90% accuracy, or however you want to sort of define it. So we've got 3 parts there. We've got the students to be able to verb, recall, then the learning target, I want them to learn state capitals. So how do I define the objective? Well, okay, learn your state capitals. That's pretty straightforward. I know what I want you to do. I'm going to tell you, hey, we're going to work on learning state capitals this week. So, you know, your objective is to learn state capitals. And then the assessment piece. How do I know that you've learned your state capitals? Do I want to see that you know half of them, or 75% of them, or 90% of them, or you got to know 100% of them, or else you're not, you know, getting out of this class? You know, whatever it is, you have to, you know, sort of determine what that is. So these are the pieces, and we'll go through talking a little bit more detail about these 3 pieces for the rest of the video. Now, before we get too far into it, though, I want to give a quick little refresher on Bloom's taxonomy. And again, this is the exact same slide that we saw in the previous video. So one of the things I want you to think about in terms of Bloom's taxonomy, and this was something that I don't think I appreciated as an undergrad, or maybe even as a master's student, but it's about the shape of Bloom's taxonomy and the fact that it is a triangle. Sometimes is shown as a pyramid if you're, you know, 3-dimensional in preference. But the triangle just seemed like a relatively arbitrary shape. And then the more I started to work with lesson planning and work with thinking about Bloom's taxonomy, the more I realized how crucial that shape was. The shape is important because it shows a sense of scale. If you look at the knowledge piece at the very bottom, it's really big. It's the biggest of the 6 sections. If you look at the very top, that evaluation piece, it's really small. So we have a building aspect to it, but we could also make this a rectangle and still have it build. We want it to build in this triangle because there's so much knowledge that we have to have in order to do some comprehension. And we have to have all this comprehension to do a little bit less application. And then it keeps building and building and building up. So if you look at that top level of evaluation, it says, you know, assessing theories, comparison of ideas, evaluating outcomes, solving, judging, recommending, and rating. So you're looking at something really complex. taking it apart, putting it back together in different pieces. If I were to ask you, how do you think the outcome of the Revolutionary War would change if George Washington had been killed in the very first battle? Um, think about how much knowledge you have to have in order to genuinely be able to answer that question intelligently. There's so much knowledge that goes into being able to answer one single question. Um, Now, you may not ask a lot of evaluation type questions in your classroom. They're pretty rare, which is also why this piece is at the very top end is so small. We're doing a lot of building up to that. Um, so um, think about the proportionality and the scale of this. Also, I'm going to kind of give you the kind of grim news here. A lot of what you're doing in your classroom is going to be knowledge and comprehension. You'll get into some application and some analysis, but because those sections are so big, that's going to be a lot of sort of the work that you're going to be doing. I don't know if you've ever had a class where you come in and the very first day you hit the ground running with like analysis, synthesis type questions, and you feel like, oh my goodness, like let me get my feet underneath me here. What you're feeling is jumping into that middle part of the pyramid and not establishing those knowledge and comprehension pieces. There's a reason why the first video was a lot of definitions, because I'm establishing that knowledge and comprehension domain before we get into this application stage that we're doing in this video. So I'm trying to model what it is that we're talking about here. You've probably also been in classes where this pyramid is scaled incorrectly the other way, where all you did was knowledge and all you did was comprehension, and you felt like I'm just memorizing facts, but I don't understand what any of this means, or I don't understand why any of this is important. It feels like busy work, and a lot of times that's what busy work is. Busy work is this comprehension, knowledge, just kind of spitting facts back out. But like, are you really quote unquote learning anything? In a sense, you are, because you're strengthening those bottom two domains, but in a big way, you're not, because you're not developing new ways of thinking at that higher order, that application and up in those domains. So we're going to talk about this framework an awful lot, because it's going to help us sort of frame that proportionality of the types of lessons and the types of objectives that we want to be doing. So on your website for the class, you'll see that there's a copy of this Bloom's Teacher Planning Kit. My suggestion, my strong recommendation for you is that you print this thing out. This thing is pretty crucial. We're going to talk about it a lot in class. We're going to use this a lot, and I'm going to help you kind of decipher at least the first part of this here in a moment. But this is available online. I don't know where it came from. I don't even remember where I found it. I don't think there's a copyright or anything on it of this particular piece, but I think this thing is incredible. And honestly, I wish I had this when I was an undergrad. It is really, really helpful. So let's look at how to use this very briefly, and we'll work with this a lot more in class when we meet. So the first place to start, I just mentioned the bottom of the pyramid. Just start with knowledge. If you're not sure where to begin, if you just start off by defining a bunch of terms, you're probably going to be okay. And even if it's terms that you feel like there's no way my students don't know this, I mean, that's a dangerous assumption. You do not want to get too far into a lesson and then realize my students have no idea what I mean by X, or students are saying X, but I think they mean different things than what I mean by X, or they're using X and Y interchangeably and they're not the same thing. So starting off with this knowledge domain, even if it's somebody tell me what this means, what this means, what this means, or even better, an entry ticket when students come in. You've got this thing already up on the board or on the projector that says, take out a piece of paper and define these three terms, or match these terms with these definitions or whatever. So when they're coming in, you're doing that initial assessment piece of like, do they know what they know, or do they know what I suspect them to know? It doesn't take a ton of time. If you suspect they already know, it's just a quick check. If it's something that's new, it's going to take a little bit more time. So now you have to introduce these ideas in a way that they're going to be able to remember them. But For right now, we're just going to assume that we're starting at knowledge. And so if you look on that Bloom sheet that I just mentioned, you can see it's this red column here, the one that's furthest on the left, this knowledge domain. And so we're going to pick that as our initial level. And then under that, you can see where it says keywords. And it's a little fuzzy here, but if you print out the sheet that's online, you'll be able to see it. And so those keywords, I mean, those are our verbs. That's it. So if you were to plug this in, let's say students will be able to locate, students will be able to select, students will be able to trace, students will be able to spell. Any of these things, we're going to put those things in there and hopefully have them fit our learning target. We realistically probably need to figure out what our learning target is first and assess how much we expect our students to understand that learning target before we pick the verb. But if you already have an idea of what the objectives kind of looks like from that image standpoint, what you kind of imagine this to be like, then you can probably pick a verb. If you pick the verb and then you realize later on it's the wrong verb, you can always change the verb. I mean, again, it's modular. It's like Mad Libs. We're just going to pop the verbs in and out as we need here until we get the right ones. If it's something that students are seeing for the first time, then it might be something like define. It might be something like listen, or something like label or identify. If it's something they're seeing for the second, third, fourth time, then we might start to use a verb like remember or recall or retell. So some of these verbs kind of have a little bit of an implication about doing it for the first time versus doing it for a subsequent time. But this is where we're gonna pick our verbs from this little list. The reason why I'm encouraging you to pick verbs off this list is that we want to make sure that we're picking verbs that are going to be observable, or they're going to be things that we're going to be able to assess. So sometimes people will pick verbs like students will be able to learn, or students will be able to enjoy, or students will be able to appreciate. It's like, I don't really know how to measure appreciating something. I mean, I suppose at the end of it, I could say, did we all appreciate that? And everyone gives me a thumbs up, but that's not really the type of assessment that I want to hang my hat on, and certainly not something that I want to base a grading period grade over. So at the end of it, students will be able to enjoy knowing the state capitals. I don't know how to get a grade out of that. Now, that's important, certainly important. I want my students to enjoy it, but that's a little bit more of a behavioral objective. That's something different than what we're talking about within this lesson plan. I always want my students to enjoy the work. I always want my students to feel engaged. I always want my students to, want to come back to class and to feel better about themselves as mathematicians. Like, all those things are really important. But they're such a universal, I don't want to put them into every single lesson plan. I don't need to cut and paste every single day. Students will feel better about themselves as math students and mathematicians. It's very true. It's absolutely true. But just not something that I need to put in there because it's not really a learning objective. So I don't want you to feel like I'm downplaying the importance of that. It's just not really that deeply embedded into what we're doing here in terms of defining learning objectives. So something that's a bigger idea like that about, students will grow in their appreciation of poetry. That's great, but that's a goal. That's not really an objective. Students will be able to recognize a haiku from a limerick, from a heroic couplet. That's a learning objective. I can observe that and measure that and assess that. I can tell whether or not you can do those things or not. So now the learning target, and this is something that's going to get fleshed out a little bit more in later classes, and also something that we'll talk a little bit more about in class. So we need to find what that thing is. A lot of this is going to be dependent on the larger unit within which you're teaching, what you think can get done that day. When you're writing your learn target, I think it's crucial to be very specific about what it is. Students will be able to retell the history of agriculture and on the planet Earth. Like, you're not doing that in a day. Stop it. Like that's too much. So we want to kind of like narrow things down as much as possible, and yet not being too specific. If you start to get too specific, you're going to find yourself writing like 20 objectives, when realistically, probably like the first 8 all get smushed into one, and the next 4 all get smushed into one, and so on and so on. So if we're defining, let's say, 6 terms that we really need for a day or for a week-long unit in class, each term does not need to be an objective. So I mean, we just put all those together. The students will be able to recall the definitions for basic terms regarding blah, whatever it is, and then put all those terms like in a parentheses or in a list or something. So we don't need to go that far into the weeds on objectives. We can put some things together. Where that balance is, we'll work on in class, and you'll start to figure out with a little bit of experience. But I would say typically you should be writing 3 to 5 objectives, probably more the 3 than the 5. It all depends on how much you're trying to get done that day and how distinct those learning targets are. Sometimes you can get away with 2. 1 objective is a big old red flag, because you're doing 55 minutes of one thing. And that I mean, it's possible, it's doable. I'd have to really look at the objectives and look at the lesson and try to get a sense of, is that there? But we'll talk a little bit more in the next video when we talk about assessments, about the bigger reason about why I kind of see that as a little bit of a red flag. So I would say 3 is a good number to start with, and then again, this is part of that increase effectiveness piece. At the end of it, looking at the lesson and saying like, oh, you know what, I did this but didn't think of it as an objective and it should be, or I set this as an objective but it's really folded in with this other thing, or where I was trying to do way too much. I got to move this to tomorrow and just really focus on this today. You'll figure out what works well for you, but 3 I think is a pretty good number. Whatever it is that you're doing, just be patient. This is not a one size fits all thing. If it was always 3 objectives, I just tell you it's always 3 objectives, but it's not. Like I said, some lessons will have 1, and it's rare, but it does happen. Some lessons will have maybe 5 or 6. Again, that's really rare, but it does happen. So be patient with yourself. This is going to take some time for you to learn what works well for you, and also what works well for the people that are going to be looking at these lesson plans. If you're department chair or your assistant principal or your principal, or whoever is your university supervisor when you're student teaching, they'll give you feedback on what is working for them. Okay, so now the assessment piece we talked about at the end. Well, we're not going to talk too much about that, because that's actually going to be the content that we're going to cover in the next video. So that assessment piece. So don't worry about that right now all too much. Just know that we need to have some sort of way of making sure that students have done the work that we want them to do. And then if they haven't, what do we do then? And then if they have, well, what do we do then? So we're going to hit that fork in the road and figure out which way we need to do, or do we walk back and walk that same road all over again? So that third piece, the assessment, don't worry about that too much right now. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. Some of you might be thinking, what about content standards? Yes, those are a thing, but that's not really a thing in this class, because everyone in this class typically is coming from different content areas. I don't know all of your content standards, because I'm a math teacher, so I know the math standards, and that's about it. So I'm not going to try to pretend like I understand the ELA or social studies or ESL or whatever standards. So that's a question that's going to get tackled a lot more in your special methods class. Those are very content specific things that'll be covered in a content specific course. For right now, we're just kind of looking at the rough skeleton of how to write a lesson plan. So at the end of this class, you will not know everything, from soup to nuts about how to write a lesson plan. This will not be the whole thing. This is a sort of the start of that process that will continue through methods. But coming out of this class, at least you'll have an idea of the structure and the framework for how to do it. So that's a great question. It's just not a question we're going to tackle in this class. Right. So for next time we come back, we're going to start talking about different levels, uses, and approaches to assessment. How are ways that we can think about assessment and carry out the actual practice of assessment, and see how much students do know the things that we want them to know. Then we'll start to connect those to learning objectives. Spoiler, every objective needs an assessment, and every assessment needs an objective. So we'll talk about how to connect one to the other. Whether or not we want to put that assessment actually in the language of the objective or not, we'll talk about that more next time. We can, but we don't necessarily have to. And then we'll start to get a little bit better idea of how to write these lesson plans, start to put these pieces in, and we'll be a large part of the way there toward actually being able to write a full lesson plan. So that's what we're going to be doing next time. If you have any questions about anything that's in the video, bring those questions to class, shoot me an email, let me know, and we'll get those questions answered. Thanks.